with the House Rules Committee. They're meeting this afternoon to set the guidelines for debate on H.R. 1. That's the Democrats' campaign finance, voting rights, and ethics legislation. The official title is the For the People Act of 2019. Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts is the chair of the Rules Committee, and we expect this bill to move to the House floor for debate tomorrow, then debate scheduled to go on for the next few days. A final House vote expected on Friday morning. Live coverage now here on C-SPAN 3.
Dramatic entry. You came from one side. I know. Better choreographed than okay.
The Rules Committee will come to order. Today, this committee is considering H.R. 1, the For the People Act. This legislation will finally address one of the most pernicious problems we face, the corrosive impacts of big money in our democracy. When I was traveling across my district ahead of the last election, something stood out. No matter what audience I was speaking to, whether it was a Democratic audience or Republican audience, everybody shook their heads in agreement on 2 points. The first is that Congress was dysfunctional. The second is that there is too much money in politics. If polling is any indication, that sentiment is not just felt in my district. According to Pew, an astounding 75% of Americans have little or no confidence in elected officials to act in the best interest of the public. This Democratic majority was elected to clean up this place and clean up our politics. We are keeping our word and doing exactly that. Fixing our broken democracy is our top priority. That is why this legislation was given the bill number H.R. 1. This legislation will stop the special interests from drowning out the voices of the public interest. It will strengthen and secure our elections, and that includes tearing down the roadblocks put in place purely to prevent some eligible Americans from casting their legal ballot. And it will strengthen ethics laws across all 3 branches of government. You know, Donald Trump talked about draining the swamp, but unfortunately he created a cesspool. When we talk about cleaning up our politics, we're actually going to do it. So this bill has already been the subject of 5 hearings that lasted more than 15 hours. We put out a call for amendments, so I expect there will be a lot more conversation here today. But before we hear from our distinguished witnesses, let me turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments that he wants to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my remarks about the bill before us, I want to address press reports about a troubling letter that's been sent or will be sent by some of our freshman Democratic colleagues requesting removal or revision to the minority right known as the motion to recommit. The motion to recommit has existed since the first Congress. It's been a guaranteed right of the minority since 1909. Its use has already been restricted once by a Democratic speaker when House rules were changed to prevent Republicans from actually sending bills back to committee. This restriction surfaced because Republicans were successful in passing MTRs during the 110th Congress. So in 2009, the rules were revised so that the minority could only instruct the committee to report the measure back, quote, forthwith, unquote, or immediately. Speaker Pelosi was quoted back then as saying, quote, when you can't win on policy, you always turn to process, unquote. And so here we are, just 2 months into the new Democratic majority, which was touted to be about open debate, with an issue about process. Make no mistake, Democrats are bothered by the fact that Republicans have successfully included good policy into two bills. Now they want to change the rules again. Put simply, this is an affront to this institution, and I would hope my good friend would be a voice for reason and ensure that we leave the MTR alone. While the letter is filled with troubling statements, let me respond to a few items so that the record's very clear on this. It says the MTR is used, quote, to derail legislation and, quote, poison debate and undermine legislation, unquote. I would submit both bills where the MTR was successful passed the House. H.R. 8 passed with 240 votes, H.J. Res 37 with 248 votes, 30 more than required for passage. 2, the letter complains that the MTR text is available, quote, only minutes before a vote. I would remind my friends that the majority controls when we vote and for how long we vote. You control the chair 100% and can postpone a vote or keep a vote open for as long as you need to whip your members against a policy initiative they would normally support. 3, finally, and maybe most troubling, it's the assertion in the letter that those that support an amendment must support final passage. Should I assume these freshman Democrats are also going to suggest a rule that if you support an amendment that passes, you must support the bill, regardless of what else is in the bill that your constituents elected you to oppose? Will we be expected to turn over our voting cards to the Speaker? I think the freshman members involved incorrectly assumed that being in the majority meant that they were would get their way on everything. As a majoritarian institution, you do have control over many things, but that doesn't mean that minority voices, including those in your own party, are completely stifled. It's not how the House was set up and not the way the MTR was worked for 110 years. It may be inconvenient for these new members, but rather than draft letters, perhaps they should brush up on the precedents of the House. I know my good friend, Chairman McGovern, is a reasonable voice in this debate, and I hope that he's able to convince his leaders that the institution suffers if the ideas of the minority are restricted even further. Thank you for that indulgence, Mr. Chairman. On the substance of this legislation, it probably will not come as a great surprise to you that I will be opposing the bill. Indeed, I think that this bill represents one of the biggest divides between what the majority is saying the bill does and what the bill actually does that I've seen actually during my time in Congress. At the press conference to introduce the bill, Speaker Pelosi said that, quote, restoring people's faith in government is really our agenda, unquote, with this bill. Sadly, I do not think that's the case. The agenda with this bill is not to restore faith in government. It's to preserve the current Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, to expand it, and to ensure that it's entrenched here for many terms to come. In each area this bill touches, the majority is attempting to change the rules of our elections and our politics to benefit them. It's an attempt to rewrite the voting laws, election laws, and campaign finance laws to fulfill one goal, to ensure the Democratic Party takes and keeps power. This bill accomplishes that goal by taking over powers normally reserved for the states and by imposing the will of Washington, D.C. on every state in the country. I will tell you, as a former Secretary of State, I can't imagine that any Secretary of State or Director of Elections would be in favor of this sort of federalization. The majority has said that they want to reform our current campaign finance system. In general, I think that's a valid goal. But instead of doing it in a way that actually fixes the system, the majority's proposal makes changes in a way that only benefits the Democratic Party. Even worse, the bill today would create a new taxpayer-funded campaign finance ATM, ensuring that certain candidates will receive large amounts of taxpayer dollars just for running a political campaign. If your goal is to fix campaign finance and level the playing field, throwing even more money into the system, especially taxpayer dollars, makes zero sense to me. The majority has said they're concerned about voter registration and voter access, and this bill does indeed propose changes to voter registration nationwide. But instead of doing it in a bipartisan, considered way that respects the authority of states to manage their own elections, the majority instead seeks to impose a massive overhaul from Washington, ensuring that one-size-fits-all approach would be imposed on the states. And by this point, it will not be surprising when I say that the changes the majority is proposing in their one-size-fits-all solution will be to the sole benefit of the Democratic Party, not to the people and not to the system. These are just two examples, but the entire bill is rife with provisions that only benefit the majority. Perhaps even more egregiously, the bill represents one of the largest and most damaging threats to free speech that we've seen in recent years. The limitations the bill would impose on free speech, especially free speech during campaigns, are so egregious that even the American Civil Liberties Union opposes this bill. I would like to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, from the ACLU, their letter opposing H.R. 1.
Without objection.
I would also like to submit, for the record, a letter from the Oklahoma State Election Board opposing H.R. 1.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, while I appreciate the majority claims is the intent of this, what the majority claims is the intent of this legislation, I do not think the majority's rhetoric is matching the facts. The proposals contained in this bill would fundamentally change our elections and our campaign finance system. Instead of fixing the problems, it's a naked and brazen attempt to rig the system in a way that will benefit the Democratic Party and keep it in power for many years to come. For these reasons, I will be opposing the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Cole, and I thank you for your statement. We disagree very strongly, obviously, on the bill. Let me just say, in regard to your opening remarks, we have not received a letter yet from anybody on the MTR, but we will certainly continue this conversation. With that, Chairperson Lofgren and Ranking Member Davis, we are delighted that you are here. Anything that you brought in writing will be, without objection, entered into the record. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for the opportunity to testify this evening about H.R. 1, the For the People Act of 2019. I respectfully ask that the Rules Committee report a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 1. This innovative legislation will advance our democracy's goal of open, responsive, and representative government. It comes to the Rules Committee, as the chairman has pointed out, after 15 hours of testimony in 5 different committees of the House, including the Committee on House Administration. This has been an open and inclusive process with many stakeholders at the table. Many of the proposals in H.R. 1 have been championed for years by our colleagues, and I'm pleased that we're now moving forward to the full House for their consideration. H.R. 1 is critically important at this juncture in our history. Trust in our government and many institutions has fallen, and without trust, our representative system suffers. About half of the voting eligible population did not vote in the 2018 midterms. We are in many ways the gold standard of participatory democracy, but a turnout rate where nearly half of eligible voters do not vote belies our aspirations. Too many Americans view themselves as shut out from our representative system. Others cannot participate because of arbitrary election administration procedures that fail to account for how Americans live and work in the 21st century. Some of these barriers to participation make it harder for certain populations, including communities of color and other underrepresented groups, to vote. This is especially the case after the Supreme Court gutted core provisions of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision has further empowered wealthy special interests and ushered in nearly $1 billion in dark money from undisclosed sources since 2010, even though the court affirmed the importance of disclosure by a vote of 8-1 in that decision. H.R. 1 reverses course and strengthens our democracy. It makes it easier and more convenient for all eligible Americans to vote. It offers solutions to the dominance of big money in politics, and it ensures that public officials work in the public interest. The bill will lower barriers to voting for all eligible Americans, save costs, bolster the integrity of election administration, and, for example, it will modernize voter registration systems by enabling automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration, take advantage of technology to ensure that all Americans can register and update their voter registration status online. Automatic voter registration alone may bring up to 50 million new eligible voters onto the rolls. It makes improvements to ensure ballot access for voters with disabilities, as well as our overseas and military voters, and it ensures early voting for at least 15 days and will require states to use voter-verified paper ballots. This is a common-sense safeguard to cybersecurity threats, especially after the 2016 election showed vulnerabilities in our systems. H.R. 1 will reform redistricting to ensure fairness in the process, guard against partisanship, and respect communities of interest. The legislation will shine a light on dark secret money that influences campaigns and protect everyone's right to know who is influencing their votes and their views. It provides an alternative but voluntary system for candidates to finance their campaigns by empowering small dollar contributors. And I would note that in the manager's amendment, we have provided that there is no taxpayer money involved in these financial systems. It is all fines. To some extent, it's the bad guys funding a good system. H.R. 1 is going to strengthen high ethical standards. It's going to boost confidence in self-government. You know, our democracy is resilient, and it requires our continued work to ensure that it lives up to its promise. H.R. 1 is a major comprehensive step forward, and I look forward to its consideration by our colleagues and to any questions that you may have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the gentleman from California for her testimony. It's now my pleasure to welcome my good friend, Mr. Davis, who is the ranking member on the committee, to offer his words of wisdom.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and great to see you here. And Mr. Ranking Member, thank you very much, and to all our colleagues who are on this Rules Committee. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've said before, the greatest threat to our nation's election system is actually partisanship. During our committee markup of H.R. 1 last week, we considered 28 amendments offered by the House administration Republicans, and not a single one was adopted. Some of the amendments offered would have removed provisions that misuse taxpayer dollars, take power away from states, and potentially weaponize the Federal Election Commission. Make no mistake, H.R. 1 was developed to serve the special interest of Democrats and the outside organizations that support the Democratic Party. We are failing the people if we don't do our due diligence to create a bipartisan election reform that will protect each American voter. H.R. 1 is legislation that violates a citizen's basic free speech rights under the First Amendment. By proposing to limit free speech and imposing vague standards that disadvantage all groups who wish to advocate on behalf of any legislative issue. Don't take my word for it. The not traditionally Republican American Civil Liberties Union expressed similar concerns, saying there are provisions that unconstitutionally impinge on the free speech rights of American citizens and public interest organizations. H.R. 1 also overreaches our Constitution by taking power away from states that decide how their elections should be administered. States that know their residents' election needs much better than people sitting in concrete buildings as part of the federal bureaucracy out here in Washington, D.C. H.R. 1 forces a federally mandated one-size-fits-all approach that will be costly and ineffective. This bill also disregards safeguards upon implementing many new voter registration and voting practices. Listen, Congress should absolutely be in favor of increasing access to the polls. However, without adding the necessary checks and balances to ensure that these accesses are protected, we are opening the door for fraud in our election system. A few fraudulent votes can change the outcome of a single election, something I can personally attest to. When you live in a competitive district like I do, every single vote makes a difference between winning and losing, including any voting irregularities. If we pass the new voter registration practices in H.R. 1 without creating safeguards around these practices to ensure we eliminate the possibility of fraudulent voting, we risk taking away the choice of the American people who voted ethically. It's another way H.R. 1 could take away the voice of each American voter. In the case of Reynolds versus Sims, the Supreme Court stated the right of suffrage can be denied by a debasement or dilution of the weight of a citizen's vote just as effectively as by wholly prohibiting the free exercise of the franchise. H.R. 1 dilutes the vote of every American by not allowing states the tools they need and have asked for to maintain their voter rolls. When H.R. 1 was introduced, it was referred to 10 House committees who were each designated to have jurisdiction over areas of the legislation. Out of those 10, only 5 committees have held hearings on H.R. 1, and out of those 5, only the smallest committee in the House, the Committee on House Administration, has held a markup. Now here we are in rules for consideration before a vote on the House floor this week. The hearing we had in House Administration was 2 panels, and I, as the ranking member of that committee, got a total of 15 minutes of question and answer to ask the panel. Our witness, the Secretary of State from the state of Washington, was the only election official out of all of the hearings by every committee before this bill was brought to you today that had somebody like Mr. Cole mentioned that would be impacted personally and professionally by this bill. So the reason this committee is considering also so many amendments is because regular order was not followed by the committees as we were promised if there was a change in leadership in the House of Representatives. My colleagues across the aisle insist that H.R. 1 is their serious effort for election reform, yet the development of H.R. 1 has been a rushed process that has not offered many members and committees due consideration of this legislation before forcing a vote in the House. And I will remind my colleagues, this bill started out as 571 pages and is now 622 pages. We just recently received the CBO score of H.R. 1, which egregiously underestimated H.R. 1's cost to taxpayers by conveniently leaving out many of the legislation's most expensive provisions. H.R. 1's campaign match provision is an outrageous cost to the American taxpayers. Make no bones about it. The 6-to-1 match program will involve taking money away from the taxpayers. H.R. 1 is creating public subsidies through the 6-to-1 government match on small dollar campaign contributions of up to $200. For every $200, the federal government will pay $1,200 of taxpayer money to a politician's campaign. That's each and every member of Congress's campaign. If H.R. 1 goes into effect, congressional candidates like all of us could potentially receive $4.3 million of taxpayer funding to fund their campaigns. In my race alone in 2018, using the formula that was in place for the 6-to-1 match, my opponent and I would have split over $6 million in an already saturated market. Despite the fact that the majority has deemed this provision not to cost the taxpayers any money, I respectfully disagree that it won't. Provisions like this one do not belong in any campaign finance or election reforms. Election reform should be bipartisan and not serving the interest of every member of Congress and every congressional candidate in the nation. I don't know anyone who has ever come up to me and has said, we need to have taxpayers funding congressional campaigns to put more money into congressional candidates. I thought the idea of H.R. 1 was to actually get money out of politics, not increase our campaign coffers. I hope my colleagues on this panel will thoughtfully consider amending H.R. 1 so that we may put forth legislation that's meant to truly serve the people. Every American's vote should be counted and should be protected. Now, yield back.
Thank you very much. And let me just say for the record, I think this has been actually a very good process from what I've been able to observe. This bill had not one, but it had 5 hearings, totaling more than 15 hours as we listened to testimony from 19 expert witnesses. I should point out in contrast, when you had H.R. 1, when my Republican friends were in charge, which showered tax benefits on the wealthiest individuals in this country. You know how many hearings you had? 0. None. And there were 0 expert witnesses who testified on that legislation. And by the way, that bill cost the taxpayers at least $1.5 trillion. This bill costs nothing. House Administration, unless I'm mistaken, the Committee of Jurisdiction held a markup. You're the primary committee. And I should point out that when my Republican friends were in charge and you did your financial deregulation bill last year, it was H.R. 10. It was roughly the same length as this bill, about 600 pages. Both bills were referred to a similar number of committees, and both were referred to oversight. In both instances, the primary committee of jurisdiction marked up the bill. For H.R. 1, that was House Administration. For H.R. 10, it was Financial Services. The committee processes were incredibly similar, and you voted for H.R. 10. I don't recall the outrage over that process when your party was in the majority, and I'll also note that the Republican rule for H.R. 10 blocked all Democratic amendments. I just want to, I point that out to kind of put everything in perspective here, and I just want to remind my colleagues that why we're here. We're here to end the dominance of big money in our politics. We're here to protect the right to vote for every American, and we're here to protect the integrity of our elections and crack down on corruption. And I think most Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents all share that goal. So with that, I yield to my colleague from Florida, Mr. Hastings. With that, I yield to my colleague from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Got a series of questions, Ms. Loughran, if I may. When was H.R. 1 actually introduced?
I don't have the date, I'm sorry.
I think it was January 3rd, so it hasn't been out there very long in a form that anybody could look at it. You mentioned how many committees was it referred to?
It was referred to, let's see, I think 4 committees, was it?
I think 5. And which committee held the markup? Only one, as I recall.
Correct. The Committee of Prime Jurisdiction, the House Administration Committee.
Just out of curiosity, anybody on that committee, and these are all members I frankly admire and hold in high regard. So anybody on that committee ever been an election official?
Well, I oversaw elections as part of the Board of Supervisors in local government.
Okay. But anybody actually administer a state system?
I don't believe any of the members are former secretaries of state.
I've reviewed the bill that was reported out of the markup. Yet the legislation we're considering today, there's an additional 175 pages of legislative text. Is that because this is legislation outside your committee's jurisdiction that you could not mark up?
Mainly. For example, we, during the markup, during the hearing, our friends across the aisle were very critical of the idea of taxpayer-funded for the pilot program and for the small donor optional program. And we heard them. So what we did at markup was to say that we are going to develop a Freedom from Influence fund that would be the sole and only source for these programs. And we adopted an amendment saying that no appropriated funds could be put in this fund, and that no funds could flow to these programs in excess of the amount in the fund. But obviously, we didn't have jurisdiction to put the fund there. And so in the manager's amendment, there is the source of the funds that we were unable to do because of jurisdictional reasons at the markup. And it is a, let me help me here, a 2.75% on federal fines, penalties, and settlements for certain tax crimes and corporate malfeasance. The fines, penalties, and settlements paid by natural persons will not be subject to the assessment except for those paid by certain executive-level officers or equivalent officers of organizational defendants. It excludes entirely from the assessment individual taxpayers not in the top marginal tax bracket and individual criminals who are not associated with an organizational defendant. So we believe that this is sound policy. The bad guys are going to pay for the good system, but we couldn't have done that at the markup, although we did make clear it would not be taxpayer appropriated funds, and we did create the fund itself without the dollars at the markup.
Mr. Chair, the manager's amendment that the chairperson is talking about is not yet adopted. It is not part of this bill that we marked up in committee. I'm certainly thankful that the chairperson actually respected many of the arguments that the three members of the House Administration Minority made during the 5-hour markup process about taxpayer dollars going into congressional campaigns. But it doesn't negate the fact that this manager's amendment, with the changes that were made less than a week ago, that were just given to us less than an hour ago, are part of a process that was open. I wish Mr. McGovern was here because I'd remind him of some of the discussions we had as we served together on the House Agriculture Committee. Not one time were any of the three members of the House Administration Committee even consulted on any portion of this bill. Yet, even with a change as drastic as this new Freedom from Influence Fund that still has not been set up with priorities or procedures or what have you. But it doesn't negate the fact that just by throwing an idea out there to increase the fines for corporate malfeasance, that somehow it makes it okay to give money that would have gone to the National Treasury for normal corporate fines, normal corporate malfeasance fines that could have been spent on infrastructure, could have been spent on pediatric cancer research. It doesn't negate the fact that this new system that has yet to be put into this bill, yet to pass, yet to be ruled in order, is ever going to do anything except protect giving congressional candidates like all of us and incumbent members of Congress like all of us more money that could have gone to the taxpayers for other priorities, but instead the Democratic majority wants these dollars to go to our campaigns. I'm not asking for $6 million more to come into my district. And that's exactly what this bill does. This is why we as a minority offered an amendment to strip this 6-to-1 provision. If there's any hesitance out of any of you on this committee that this is a provision that could enrich the campaign coffers of every one of us, then take an amendment, strip it out, get rid of it, make the bill better. This provision is not something that we need.
Let me ask a couple questions on that, and I would address this to both of you. Does this fine mechanism apply to every fine leveled by the federal government, or
No.
is it just focused on political activity?
No, it's tax cheats, but it's a de minimis assessment for tax crimes and corporate malfeasance, but for individuals in the highest tax bracket.
Now, as I understand the CBO score, that it really told us they didn't have enough time to score this bill, all these provisions. I mean, I have to tell you, I count me as enormously skeptical that something totally unrelated to political activity will magically give us exactly the right amount of money that you need.
Well, on that point, we've made clear, and this was in the markup in House Admin, that the amount to be allocated towards the small donor match program is limited to whatever amount of money actually is gained. So, and there's a provision that if it is not enough to meet the criteria, you drop down the dollar amount that will be in the program. It is limited to the amount that is actually.
Is every candidate who files for Congress eligible for this match? This isn't just Republicans and Democrats, right?
No.
So, yes or no?
There's eligibility requirements.
Which are?
Let me refer you to the section of the bill. It is, well, I don't have the bill number here. Section 5144 is what we are adding in terms of the appropriated funds. But the system actually would increase candidate diversity. Candidates would have to raise at least $50,000 from 1,000 small donors, $200 or less. And there would be a cap on the amount that could be received. 50% of the average amount of the top 20 most expensive winning
If I'm correct,
campaigns.
this has not gone through committee? So
No,
nobody
this did go through committee.
Really? I
The
thought it
only
was being
thing that-
added in the manager's amendment.
No, the only thing that got added in the manager's amendment was the source of the funds, because we didn't have jurisdiction to do a 2.75% additional fine.
Pretty big change for a manager's amendment. Do you have any comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cole. I get frustrated by the constant changes to the process on such a major piece of legislation that is being rushed through. I mean, granted, the House Administration Committee did have jurisdiction. We did a 5-hour markup. In that markup, I was hopeful from comments from Chairperson Lofgren that other committees would also mark up this piece of legislation. But to now be told that a new fund is going to be created and we don't have jurisdiction over that, that just shows that we need more markups. We need other committees of jurisdiction to take advantage of this. But I would ask, you know, based on the comments of Chairperson Lofgren, Mr. Cole, I don't know if you know this, but I endorsed a Democrat for election in November of 2018. My friend, Democrat Dan Lipinski out of Chicago. Why? Not just because he's my friend, which he is, but a neo-Nazi, an avowed neo-Nazi, was running against Mr. Lipinski. Under the plan that is being put forth, his opponent, an avowed neo-Nazi, could have been eligible for government taxpayer dollars to be able to go into his campaign. Would have been eligible for this 6-to-1 match. I don't think that's what the majority intends, but that's exactly what the majority is going to get.
With all due respect to my friends on the committee, again, who I admire, I will just tell you, this legislation changes every state's electoral system in America. So telling me a 5-hour markup and 15 hours worth of hearings where we had exactly one state official come and testify and know people serving, you know, with serious background in this area, that is an extraordinary rush to judgment. I know how the people in my state feel about it, at least how the election officials feel about it, so I submitted a record. Let me ask you a couple other things, if I may.
May I, in response to your first question,
Absolutely.
I would note another thing that the manager's amendment, we heard complaints from our friends across the aisle about the Election Day holiday for federal employees. That was not in the jurisdiction. The way we did the markup, we marked off the elements that were not within our jurisdiction. Most of it was, but this was not. So the manager's amendment strikes that federal election holiday as recommended by the minority.
Well, that's great, but there's 175 pages of this bill that weren't marked up by anybody because you didn't have the jurisdiction. And certainly the minority didn't participate in the manager's amendment.
Mr. Cole, we didn't participate in any crafting of this legislation, nor were we asked.
Okay. Well, Ms. Lofgren, if I may, do you know, and you may not, did Speaker Pelosi direct other committee chairmen not to hold markups on H.R. 1?
I don't know.
Well, just for the record, Mr. Chairman, I want to submit a number of ranking members have asked that their committee chairman to hold hearings or markups on this important piece of legislation. And I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter from Ranking Member Jordan requesting a markup on H.R. 1. Request, thank you very much, was ignored by the Speaker and Chairman Cummings. And also a letter from Ranking Member Walden, request for a sequential referral to H.R. 1, which was ignored by the Speaker.
Without objection.
Thank you. This highlights the rushed process undertaken by the majority. There's not even time to adjudicate whether Energy and Commerce Committee even had jurisdiction in this matter. Mr. Davis, as the primary committee of jurisdiction over this legislation, I imagine you must have, again, had hours of testimony and debate in crafting the legislation. You think you had adequate time to consider the bill and discuss the witnesses and stakeholders?
Absolutely not. This bill obviously was written by members of the majority along with outside organizations that were credited during the initial press conference. When this bill was introduced, just days after we were all sworn into this Congress. It's very interesting for a majority that supposedly came in for more openness, more transparency, and more bipartisanship. H.R. 1 was not, we as committee members were not afforded any opportunity to participate in the process until we had the 5-hour markup in the Committee on House Administration. And I am very thankful that we made good points during that markup and that Chairperson Lofgren has decided to make some changes, but I certainly wish that the members of the House Administration Committee would have adopted our amendments to make those changes better. But the key point is we've got to get back to the drawing board on this.
Mr. Davis, how many amendments did your members, Republican members, offer?
Initially 37, we combined a few and officially did 28.
Ms. Lofgren, my understanding is the markup is that the only 2 Democratic amendments offered were the amendment in the nature of a substitute and a technical amendment, both sponsored by you.
Correct.
No other Democrat had a single idea in committee to offer as an amendment?
Well, there were no other amendments. And I will say this, ordinarily, a bill is introduced by a member, and that was done in this case by Mr. Sarbanes. He has a number of co-sponsors. As we know from the pamphlet, How Our Laws Are Made, the markup isn't when the bill is being written and introduced. That process is later. We did have that markup in the House Administration Committee. It went on for a long time. Nobody was cut off. Amendments were offered, and we didn't agree with them because most of them were to eliminate big sections of the bill that we agreed with. At one point, I even said, if you had better amendments, we accept them. We just have a disagreement on what we should do here, and that's why we were unable to agree to the amendments.
I have to tell you, I'm astonished. The 600-page bill that changes the election system in every state in America, there wasn't a single Democratic amendment? I mean, it's mind-blowing to me. I mean, I've never seen anything like it.
Well, I think there are a number that are being offered here this evening, so.
Well, that will be interesting. I'm sure we'll have a late night. It'd be a whole lot better if the Committee of Jurisdiction and supposedly expertise were making those decisions rather than us. I have to tell you, Mr. Chairman, I'm very disappointed in the process. I think we can and should do better. And you've rightly pointed out in instances where we've come up short. I think this is one that you're going to look back on as legislators, my friends on the other side of the aisle, and look back and really regret this process. You're going to go home and talk to your secretaries of state and your supervisors of elections, and they're going to ask you why you didn't call them, or why you didn't get it to them, or why didn't you talk to them. I'm very glad mine took the initiative all on its own to send me what their concerns were. I didn't contact them, but they certainly made sure they had a big concern about it. I want to go quickly to this match part, this newly created government matching program for small dollar expenditures. Section creates a 6-to-1 government match to any small donor contribution of $200 or less in a congressional or presidential campaign with a cap on it, meaning that every $200 the federal government will match $1,200. What if a major donor just writes $200 checks to every single candidate? Mr. Bloomberg might do something like that. Nothing wrong with it. It would be legal under this legislation. You may end up stretching the dollars of large donors that have the ability to do that. Was there any discussion about that? Any thought about that? Mr. Davis?
Yes, Mr. Cole, Mr. Ranking Member, there were. We introduced an amendment that would require, since this $200 limit is the limit for unitemized contributions in all of our FEC reports. But since that $200 would then be matched by another $1,200, that would then put the total combined match over the limit.
Would we even know the major donor that did that, since he was writing a $200 check that wouldn't be reportable?
You are 100% correct. We would not. And an amendment that the majority voted down on a party line vote would have actually made disclosure of that donor evident. And keep in mind, let's go back to the person who ran against Dan Lipinski. He could have raised $50,000 from donors throughout this nation who agreed with his sickening policies and sickening ideas, and we would have not known any of them, who they were, and it could have then been matched by 6 times the amount of taxpayer dollars.
The $200 donor is disclosed under this program. The amendment would have required disclosure for $200 and below donations for people who did not participate in this program, which is not currently the law, and we thought unnecessary under Federal Election Commission.
This is an important point. I want to make sure I understand your point. So let's say I'm a super rich guy, and I decide I want to write a $100 check to every Republican
Or
candidate.
$199.
$199. Would that be disclosed?
Yes,
How?
as part of this process.
How? I mean, who's going to, where's the record exist? The campaign has the record. The FEC doesn't have the record.
It's through the Federal Elections Commission.
That they don't have those records. They can't look at it.
Well, this is setting up the program so they will have these records, and that
So
the 200 and below will be disclosed.
Every person that donates that
Who
gets a
participates in
match,
this program.
their name will become public.
Correct.
Good, because I will guarantee you, whether it's public or not, having once chaired my party's campaign committee, I can assure you they're going to go to their major donors and lay this out as something you ought to do in a program that they start to market. And they'll do the same thing, you know, on both sides of the aisle. I mean, you could drive a truck through this thing in terms of getting rich people involved in giving relatively small amounts of money that the government then magnifies by a factor of 6. I mean, that's what's going to happen. I guarantee you that will happen. And the Democratic National Committee will do it. The Republican National Committee will do it. And I'll tell you what, some pretty nutty fringe groups are going to figure this out that have 1 or 2 wealthy people that support them, and they're going to start doing it. I just think this requires a lot of thought. What's the limit that an individual campaign could receive? Because I know there is a limit there.
The limit is 50% of the average amount of the top 20 most expensive winning campaigns from the prior election. So in 2018, that would have been roughly a $4.5 million per candidate limit. And so going back to your example, I don't know if that would happen or not, but if you had, you need to have $50,000 of 200 and below, you're only going to get to the max anyhow. Yeah. And so whether you and the point is, since we're trying to wean people off from reliance on big bucks people, the person who writes a $200 check who's a billionaire has no more influence than the person who writes a $200 check who's a thousandaire. I mean, the point is that you will not be able to have undue influence because you have provided big bucks to a candidate.
Count me as a skeptic. I promise you that not only will the parties organize these mechanisms, we have a lot of individual candidates that raise money in a variety of ways. You're going to actually incentivize people to lose money while they raise a private dollar because they'll make it back 6-fold over in this deal. And you'll have, and I know you're trying to target this to candidates and presidential campaigns. I promise you the committees will set up deal and they will get their individual members to donate that, to get money that way, and then turn around and donate it to the DCCC and the NRCC and every other campaign. I mean, it's amazing.
Mr. Cole?
Please.
Mr. Ranking Member, I appreciate the opportunity. I want to clarify, Chairperson Lofgren is right. A donation of $200 or more would be itemized. But again, a donor donating $199 to every member of the Republican conference or the Democratic conference would then get a 6-to-1 match for each and every one of those candidates without knowing who that person is. It would fall under the unitemized contributions. The amendment we tried to pass in committee would have made sure that if they were going to be matched by taxpayer dollars, they're going to be matched by the 6-to-1 program, that we would know who they are, which I think should be the intention of election reform and should be the intention of campaign finance reform. The biggest frustration I have right now is Chairperson Lofgren admitted that we made some good points that this 6-to-1 program is needed to be revised. But the revision is to now create a new account that's going to be funded by corporate malfeasance. So in the end, the idea of rushing a 571-page bill, now 622-page bill, to get money out of politics is now a solution that's going to put more corporate money into our campaign coffers. I don't think that's the intention, but that's the result. Corporate fines, corporate dollars will go to each and every one of our campaigns if we allow this 6-to-1 match program to come through as intended. And it could take away from where those dollars should go within the federal government to do things like build bridges and fund cancer research.
Mr. Cole, I want to just clarify something.
Absolutely, please.
If you take a look at Section 522, which is within Section 5111, page 433, line 20, it provides for enhanced disclosure of information on donors, and it includes the mandatory identification of individuals making qualified small donor dollar contributions. So anybody who's in this program making a small dollar is disclosed. I think my friend here misspoke. If you're not in the program, then the regular disclosure rules apply. And the regular disclosure rules, if you're not in the matching program, are that you don't have to disclose if you're under $200.
Well, there's clearly some uncertainty about that.
I don't think there is.
Well, I'm sorry, I have a different opinion, as I do in many pieces of this legislation. But beyond that, whether it's disclosed or not, you really want one person to be able to write 1,000 checks and it gets matched 6 to 1, which is possible under this situation, whether you knew about it or not. And that will happen. That will occur. That's not, that's not a projection. It's not even just a prediction. It's pretty near certainty in the way politics work. Mr. Davis, I have another question here. Sometimes things that aren't in a bill are as important as things that are. Current law prohibits the government from requiring disclosure of political contributions as part of the bid to get a government contract. I've got some familiarity with this issue as I authored the rider on the appropriations bill in 2011, which became law. I have strong concerns that H.R. 1 that repeals this provision. It's human nature that this information will influence the decision, regardless of what the law requires, what a contracting officer is required to do. If we're interested in enshrining a pay-for-play culture as part of the contracting process, this doesn't. Nobody should have to reveal their political contributions when they're bidding on a government contract. Why are we taking that out of law?
I don't know why. Again, it's another problem with this mammoth piece of legislation, Mr. Ranking Member. I appreciate your concern because, as I think all of us have seen, there's been numerous instances of what we would consider corporate bullying. There's no one that should be, there's no one that should not be able to bid for tax dollars to be able to participate in a federal contracting opportunity. Just because they may have supported one candidate or the other should not disqualify him or her or their company. I do, if you give me a second, I want to go back to what Chairperson Lofgren said about the disclosure requirements. From what I recall in the markup process, this new disclosure requirement for anybody participating in the program was not part of the underlying bill. And since I just received the manager's amendment less than an hour and a half ago, it's another instance of the majority trying.
No, it was part of the underlying.
Well, it's another instance as to why this bill is being rushed through to send a message, but instead it's going to have a drastic and dramatic effect on the way campaigns are financed for every member of Congress. Again, a vote for this bill is a vote to actually enrich the campaign coffers of every single member who's voting yes. That's the bottom line.
Madam Chair, did you?
It was part of the underlying bill and discussed at Mark. I don't know what else to say. On the issue that you've raised, I think people can obviously do disagree, but I think many of us believe that voters have a right to know if government contractors are giving to dark money groups. And that was the rule. It was, you disagreed, you had the opportunity to eliminate that. And those of us who thought that was incorrect are now going back to correct your mistake.
Well, I don't think you're going to do that because I don't think this is going to go much past this
could
chamber.
be. We'll see.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd like to submit for the record the statement of the administration policy, which says very clearly if this law or if this legislation would become law, the President's advisor would recommend that he veto the bill.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you've been very generous with time. I appreciate that very much. And I know we're going to have a long night here anyway, so I'll withdraw for the moment and look forward to continuing discussion with our witnesses.
All right, thank you. Ms. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's pretty clear here that if you support gerrymandering, if you support the current status quo of members of Congress drawing or state legislatures drawing congressional districts to favor one party over the other, where courts have said bad, 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 then you support this bill. If you support dark money in politics, meaning that corporations are a person, then you are against this bill. If you support shutting down polling places for the purpose of keeping people that look like me from voting, African-American people from voting, then of course you are against this bill. Of course you are. You know what? It is about time that Congress support common sense, comprehensive reforms to protect voting rights and crack down on corruption. We watched foreign powers shamelessly attempt to interfere in and influence our elections. Unlike California, many states have enacted restrictive voter ID laws that target minorities and limit access to the ballot box. And in some races, Americans aren't choosing their elected officials, politicians who have rigged the system and gerrymandered their districts are choosing their voters. Imagine that. Us choosing our voters versus our voters choosing us. H.R. 1 is a commendable step to restoring America's faith in our democracy. This legislation enhances election security, increases transparency, and safeguards voting rights. And I'm proud to co-sponsor Congresswoman Spanberger's amendment that will inform Congress and state election officials of security threats before a general election. To keep our government truly representative, I also co-sponsor Congressman Dean Phillips' amendment to ensure that the Federal Election Commission's Blue Ribbon Advisory Panel consists of individuals from different political parties and diverse gender and ethnic backgrounds. So, to be clear on the issue that was being debated earlier, you have to be a willing participant for this process that is being introduced. Let me find my note here. To participate in the program, correct, Ms. Loughlin? You have to be a willing participant.
But it's voluntary.
Okay. Can you walk me through that process? If I am a candidate, I file with the FCC,
You have to,
or FEC, Federal Elections Commission.
Federal Elections Commission, you have to raise at least $50,000 from contributions.
But I have to sign that I
Correct.
will limit myself to these
Right.
expenditures.
That's right.
And I will honestly disclose who is donating money to my campaign.
Correct. And the match goes into play when you've reached your 50,000 threshold and is limited to the amount of money actually collected in this fund that we're doing through corporate misconduct.
So if I don't want to participate in this process, and I choose not to disclose all my donors, can I do that?
Well, you still have to live within the current
With
FEC
current,
rules, correct?
But I could have my cake and eat it too, right?
Well,
Meaning
it's
I could participate in this.
you could, or not.
Or not.
It's the candidate's choice. And I think, I don't want to speak, I think Mr. Sarbanes will be here if he's not here now, and this was really his vision. But I think the motivation is that if you're going to do a public financing provision, you have to have some hope that will raise enough money to actually be competitive, which was why the 6-to-1 match was included. We heard very clearly the objection from our friends on the other side of the aisle about the possibility of taxpayer money doing that, and that's why we changed that in the markup and then created this fund through an additional assessment on corporate wrongdoers.
So how does this bill, moving on to the next subject, how does this bill address partisan gerrymandering and promote election integrity?
Well, it does, it creates using the jurisdiction found in Article 1, Section 4 of our Constitution, it allows for federal redistricting requires independent citizen commissions do the redistricting. There's a whole long section to make sure that the people who are selected are not partisans, and provides for rules that they must follow in doing the redistricting. So it's not partisan, making sure that we've elevated voting rights issues, because we want to make sure that this does not result in discriminatory districts, but also respecting, after we're assured of that on that point, that communities of interest have been respected. There is a provision that allows, if there's misconduct, for recourse to the federal courts for correction at several stages. So I think it's
a citizens redistricting commission sort
similar
of like
to what we have in
California.
California, correct?
Okay, which was the freight the Democrats paid to the Republicans in California when we needed a vote for the budget.
That's correct.
And we had a $15 billion deficit. And unfortunately, it didn't quite work out as Republicans wanted, so then later they sued.
Well, I'll just say this, you know, when parties have a chance, they use the redistricting process to their advantage. Both parties do it. The Democrats do it when they control the legislature. The Republicans do it when they control the legislature. Nobody's hands are completely clean on this. And I just think it's way better for the voters to choose their elected officials than the elected officials to choose the voters. I'll be honest, and this is, you know, known, when the measure in California was on the ballot, I had qualms. I wasn't for it. I thought, why should California give up their advantage? They're a blue state, you know, until every state does it. I'll tell you this, I was wrong, the voters were right. The thing works in an apolitical way, just the way it should. And we want to make sure that every voter in America has the equivalent right to select their own representative to Congress. That's really why the Article 1, Section 4 authority is there, for us to make sure that all Americans are treated equally in terms of redistricting, access to the ballot, opportunity to exercise the franchise as an American citizen.
How will this bill fix the problem created in North Carolina, the voter fraud issue?
Well, first off, I want to thank you for your comments on redistricting. I certainly am supportive of the provisions that are in this bill when it comes to redistricting, and I certainly would like your assistance and also Chairperson Lofgren's in convincing our colleagues from your side of the aisle, from Illinois, to maybe go along with redistricting reform. That's one that I've mentioned during the hearing, and the one hearing we had and during the markup process. So we can work together on that in the future. How does this fix what happened in North Carolina? The bill doesn't. And that was an amendment that we offered, Ms. Torres. We offered an amendment to outlaw ballot harvesting because we've seen where it is illegal in North Carolina, somebody took advantage of that and could possibly go to jail. That's why we introduced the amendment that was voted down on party lines. And unless it's part of a manager's amendment I haven't had a chance to go through, I'm assuming that's still the case, that ballot harvesting will still be legal nationwide when we've already seen the fraud that can be committed.
If I may on that point, it's ironic that in North Carolina, you can't let another person who's not your immediate family take your ballot to the poll for you. Well, if you're an isolated elderly person, you may not have a family member available to do that. But that's against the law, and that's where this apparent, really serious misconduct occurred. In contrast, in California, it is perfectly legal for an isolated elderly person to give that ballot to their next door neighbor if they want, have them take it to the poll, and yet there have been no credible allegations of misconduct relative to that. So the remedy that was proposed at committee was the one that existed in North Carolina where the fraud occurred. Obviously, that was not workable in North Carolina. It's because there was fraud. There was a crime, I believe. We'll find out, you know, when the court proceedings continue, but it sure looks pretty serious.
How will this bill fix the problem in Georgia, disenfranchising voters shutting down or relocating at the very last minute polling locations?
Well, it provides for requirements on where polls should be, as well as for notification. But the real answer is ample early voting and no excuse vote by mail, so that even if, a poll is inconvenient, you're going to have opportunities to vote for at least 15 days prior to the election. No excuse vote by mail, so that, a lot of people on election day, if they're working till 9 and the polls close at 8, you're not going to get there in time. But if you can have your vote by mail prior to that, you've solved the problem.
Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does me good to see you sitting in the chairman's chair.
Feels good. I was thinking about a coup here.
When you want to put the Hastings portrait up on the wall, you have my support to make that happen. That I had anticipated enjoying this hearing when it came around. Didn't know it was going to come quite this quickly. The two of you are, in my estimation, are two of the most thoughtful members on the floor of the House. And if anybody could come together and find common ground on what are very sticky, political, easy to inflate the level of partisanship around, you would be the two I'd pick to try to sort that out. And I can't tell you how much I feel like we've missed yet another opportunity to see the two of you sitting there opposed to one another here, as opposed to congratulating one another on how well you work together through what I know would have been a very difficult process. My friend from California, Ms. Torres, referenced race as why folks would oppose this bill. I find that evidence that we have reached that heightened politicized area. I don't think, in fact, I think the ranking member closed with wanting to, I wrote it down, Mr. Davis, I don't want to misquote you. Every American vote should be counted and protected. I don't think that's remotely divisive. I think that's something that you and the chairwoman share. I think we all share that. I represent a majority-minority district. I think I had the closest election in the Congress. Starting at election night, as the reporters called, I said, I'm not worried about a thing because I know the Democrats on our election board and I know the Republicans on our election board, and they would sooner cut off their hand than be involved in any sort of shenanigans around here. I don't know how the vote's going to go, but however it goes, I'm prepared to live with it because I know these people. We're in a community together, and we count on one another. I know every community is not that fortunate, and so I very much appreciate the effort to try to give everyone else the confidence that I have in the election process in Georgia. But I am struck by the rush on something that is so serious and something that could be so bipartisan. Help me, I've looked at the section that you've referenced, Ms. Lofgren, and it appears to read exactly as you said it does: enhanced disclosure information on donors, mandatory identification of individuals for small donors. But there was an amendment that was offered by Republicans in the markup to do exactly that. How can it be that we're in the Rules Committee days later talking about what was really fundamental and apparently a shared value, and that doesn't come out in a committee hearing that folks are on the same page on this issue? I can't understand how a Republican amendment to do exactly this gets rejected. And folks would say it gets rejected because it doesn't do this. I'm just, you know how legislative drafting goes. What I'm looking at just says insert here. I can't tell what section it gets inserted in. I don't know if it does it or not, but I did want to clarify one thing. What it does say is each authorized committee of a participating candidate under this title shall elect to include in their reports these identifications. I've never seen that before, shall elect. Either you shall or either you may elect. But I've never seen shall elect before, and I don't know what that means, and if that's a part of the challenge here.
Well, as we know, we have Ledge Counsel who does these wonderful things, so I don't want to speak for them, but it's our understanding that this is mandatory.
Okay.
Mr. Woodall, maybe the confusion you have is the reason why Ledge Council allowed us to draft an amendment doing just that. Maybe they were confused too.
It is important. I've seen those candidates, and I don't want to offend any of my colleagues here who engage in that kind of campaigning, but those folks who spend $5 million in direct mail so they can raise $100,000. They chew through every dollar that they raise from that little old lady who believed in them, and they just plow it back in. I can imagine that kind of harvesting. There's a cap on what I can receive back in matching, and that cap is $1 million?
It's 50% of the top 20 winning candidates in the election prior, what was spent.
In the case of 2018, Mr. Woodall, then you would have been able to receive $4.5 million.
Wow. So it does encourage folks to do those mail campaigns where they're not raising any money at all, but they're bringing in contributions that they're spending directly because now the government's going to give me a six-time match. I just ran the most expensive election of my 5 cycles and spent just over $1 million. But I have consistently been the one who has more small dollar contributions than anyone else in the election. That's how I won my primary to begin with. You're saying that I would now be running $5 million races because there'd be this free money that the government is sending my direction. I don't know how that's going to advantage the people of the 7th District, but I'll wait to see. Ms. Lofgren, let me ask you about CBO scores because I serve on the Budget Committee, and I know I know you all were just one of many committees that got the reference. The CBO score that I'm looking at appears to only score the part of the bill that's within House administration jurisdiction. Is that right?
Let me see. Do we have the CBO letter?
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the CBO score be submitted for the record.
I don't have that. Oh, here we are.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, I think it's scored the entire bill. It's just as reported by the committee.
Well, were you all able to report all the titles that were not in your jurisdiction? I would guess those were stripped out.
Good point, good point. We'll have to clarify that for you.
Because that is the clarity I was looking for. Had it been scored as it was drafted, then we would have gotten everything. But scored as reported, we're only getting your slice of the pie. And my reading of the CBO report says that's $2.4 billion over 5 years. Your slice of the pie.
I think that's correct. But I do believe that in the manager's amendment that we will offer, we have proposed some changes on the authorization for some of the grants so that it would be subject to appropriations instead of, and that we've shared that with CBO, whether they will actually be able to give us a report or not. We will have to hear from them.
Now that's $2.4 billion subject to appropriation. Is there anything in here about changing budget caps, or that's all getting stuffed? That's $2.4 billion stuffed under the current budget caps, so it's going to have to come from other priorities. We're not making any headroom to spend this money. We're going to have to take it from somewhere else.
I don't know the answer to that, sir. I'll have to get back to you on that.
So if I have the one CBO report that has the House Administration section, because you all have studied the bill in ways that I have not, do you know what the Judiciary Committee's estimated cost is, their section of the bill?
They didn't have much, and I don't think that there would be the redistricting provision was within the Judiciary Committee, but the position of the CBO is that mandates required to promote a constitutional right are not scored. And so I don't think there would be a score to that provision.
And what about the OGR's section, the Government Reform Committee? Is there any idea about what their section might cost?
I do not have the answer to that, but the big pay for was the federal holiday for federal workers. And as I mentioned earlier, we took the advice of our colleagues in the minority on the committee, and we're proposing to delete that.
I have not gotten through the entire CBO score, but I get the sense that had they had more time, they would have done a different score. Was there any suggestion that CBO did not have the time to?
I did not hear that, but I will say the discussion has been at a staff level. I didn't go over to CBO.
I'm thinking about why something like this gets rushed to the floor, and I mean that sincerely. I remember my chairman asked, not you, Mr. Hastings, but Mr. McGovern asked, where was the outrage when H.R. 10 was coming to the floor? And I was thinking, well, the outrage was right here where Mr. McGovern was sitting during that process. I remember it. I remember it well, and he was right to be frustrated. Sometimes we get locked into a calendar. Is there any sense, Madam Chair, that we could have reached that bipartisan goal? Again, I think in many cases, this is something that only you and Mr. Davis could do. You all are in your leadership positions for a reason. You have the trust and confidence of your members in ways that a lot of folks in this institution have not earned it. Was there any sense that you would be able to reach a bipartisan goal when you began the H.R. 1 process, Madam Chair? Or did you expect from day one we were going to end up in the very partisan conversation that we're having?
I'll be honest, and I think Mr. Davis and I get along. We just did our oversight hearing. I took every single recommendation made by the minority. But I think Mr. Davis and I think the two parties disagree fundamentally on some of these items. And talking about it longer wouldn't have changed that disagreement in terms of making bigger efforts to expand the capacity of American citizens to actually get registered to vote and exercise that franchise.
Tell me about some of those disagreements. I'm thinking about the public financing in particular. It has been in my short tenure in Congress. Republican Congress passed it. Republican House, Democratic Senate. President Obama signed it, moving away from public financing. Here we are running headlong in the largest move towards public financing that the nation has ever seen. What has changed here? I would have said as a body we have spoken out and said no, but your committee has come back and said not only let's do it, but let's do it in the to the tune of billions and billions of dollars.
I think here's what's changed. We heard loud and clear in the election last year people's concern about the undue influence of big money, undisclosed money in politics. I know I heard that everywhere. And so this voluntary program, which would not be funded by taxpayer dollars, which is different than the old system, which was a checkoff system, this is going to be paid for by wrongdoers. The guys who did wrong things are going to pay for a clean system. And to allow, and I understand Mr. Cole talking about, people with lots of money could do small contributions, but it's from the point of view of, do people with big money get undue influence? And we don't want that. We want the regular people of America, their voice is going to be heard just as loudly as some fat cat. And that's why this has been proposed, so that we could get away from that system of big money, secret money, and have disclosed money and small donors so that people, regular people, regain control of their electoral system.
I recognize the desire to end the influence of big money, but was the only idea that the committee considered was taking what would have otherwise been dollars coming into the federal coffers and spending those on elections?
Well, that's not accurate, because this is an increase. This is dollars that don't currently exist, and we're proposing an increase on the fine, a de minimis increase of 2.75% that does not currently exist, that would go into this Freedom from Influence Fund.
But for your directed spending of that money, if you raise those fines 2.7%, that money would have come straight into the Treasury.
And if pigs could fly.
Well, that's what I'm saying. raising money is a hard thing to do, and
Correct.
asking people to spend more, to pay more money is a hard thing to do. You all have found a way to ask for it, but instead of putting it towards deficit or putting it towards anything else, you've decided to put it towards a new program. I know everybody at this time.
Well, and people can disagree, but I do think, there's really, I can't think of something that's more valuable than clean elections and free democracies.
And from your viewpoint, the public financing is the only pathway you all could find to get there.
No, as you'll note from the bill, there are a number of other sections that relate to disclosure of contributions. I heard the ACLU's comment on disclosure, but they've always been against disclosure. They were against McCain-Feingold when that came out, and they were for Citizens United. But in Citizens United itself, the court said on an 8-to-1 vote that disclosure is the answer to unlimited donations. And the Disclose Act that's included in this bill applies to groups that spend $10,000 or more on campaign disbursements like campaign ads, so that this dark money, even though it exists, and we cannot through legislation change that because of the Citizens United case, we can do exactly what the Supreme Court said, including the most conservative members, shine a light on it, let people know what's being spent so they know who's trying to influence them, and they can make their own decision. I'll give you an example of how that works. Several years ago in California, there was a ballot initiative that attempted to regulate smoking in restaurants, and it was like 80% approval, until it became clear, and we found out, because California has this rule for initiatives, that it was being funded by the tobacco companies to actually preempt stronger regulations that cities and counties had adopted. That approval rating went from like 80% to nothing because people found out they were being had. So information in the hands of voters is important.
Of course that's true. I think about the agreement you and Mr. Davis have on redistricting reform. As long as I've known Mr. Davis, he's been fighting to make sure votes are counted and protected. You would be the partner of the chairwoman on the redistricting panel, but I heard Mr. Cole speak out vehemently as a former leader of a campaign committee, the dangers of public financing. But you're pro-reform, but still vehemently anti-public financing.
Absolutely. I don't know anyone who's clamoring besides the entire Democratic conference who have co-sponsored this bill, and the outside special interest groups that the sponsor of the bill bragged about helping them write the bill days after we were sworn in. I don't know anybody who's clamoring for taxpayer financing of our congressional campaigns. And let me remind you too, and remind the committee, Mr. Woodall, the new corporate fund that Chairperson Lofgren is talking about being used if everything works out correctly, if everything passes, that would be used to fund all of our congressional campaigns through this new system that the majority party is trying to set up, is not even part of the bill yet. The bill that we are debating still has public financing for congressional campaigns. The manager's amendment has to be accepted and passed. And again, the manager's amendment was one that I got as the ranking member of this committee less than 2 hours ago.
I have to correct you. That is incorrect. In the markup, we created the Freedom from Influence Fund. We adopted a measure that no taxpayer appropriated funds would be provided for the Freedom from Influence Fund. And we also adopted a scenario that if there was no money in that program, the money provided to campaigns would be stepped down to the extent there was not enough funding to supply it. So that was all in our markup.
So when the CBO is scoring the bill as the committee marked it up and says there's $2.4 billion in expenses that are subject to appropriation, we're not talking about this
No.
at all?
No, it's primarily the grants, the voting system grants, the election assistance grants, EAC reauthorization.
So the costs of this fund may well dwarf the in the manager's amendment. Do we have an estimation of what $2.7 percent of these fines turns out to be? What kind of volume?
There is an estimate, but since the fund itself is capped at whatever flows into it from the 2.75%, if it doesn't fully fund these campaigns, and then the system will not be fully funded.
Let me turn to voter integrity.
Mr. Woodall, may I make a quick comment? I believe the CBO report also says with the Freedom from Influence Fund, it could possibly cost upwards of $1 billion more in the CBO report. And that's just the estimate, since we're not aware of what these impending costs would be. And frankly, Chairperson Loughran just mentioned, well, I mean, it just seems like excuse after excuse when we bring up good points as to why this bill should have gone through a much more fervent process. The problem we have is, well, it's only going to go up to the cap. Well, then how's that going to change the influence of elections? If you philosophically think that a public financing option is the way to go, and then at the same time limiting what that public option can be, then why are we having the public option to begin with?
Turning to voter integrity, I know that's on everybody's mind. You read in your opening statement from exactly that position that we do dilute everyone's vote. We fail to protect every voter if we don't. Getting them to polls is half of the job, but making sure that their vote is not diluted with illegal votes is also a part of the job. Ms. Loughran, could you point me to some of the safeguards?
I'm sorry?
Could you point me to some of the safeguards and standards in here that you all are targeting specifically at eligible voters?
Sure.
And I say that in the context of requiring now that voter registration happen online. I have real concerns. We're doing away with all of our voting machines in Georgia. We're doing a whole upgrade because of our concerns about voter integrity. Online registration, tell me how it is that the bill guarantees that only voters are getting registered through that system.
Well, the first thing to know is that every person who's registering has to be advised of the consequences, what the standards are, and what their liability is should they stray from that requirement. What we've found is that the online voting registration has worked very successfully in 9 states and the District of Columbia, and 6 additional states are in the process of implementing it. This afternoon, I got a call from the governor of Oregon, who's their prior Secretary of State, who thanked me for this bill, who said that it would, she said that they have implemented online voter registration, that it has worked seamlessly. So that is one of the issues.
Is that what the gentleman from Washington State was called to testify about? I know
it's a she.
I'm sorry, the gentlelady from Washington State, when she was called to testify, was she voting on was she testifying?
You know, it's interesting because we talked to her about vote by mail, which Washington State does completely vote by mail. She was effusive about vote by mail, but she wasn't for requiring it for federal elections in other states. That really is a philosophical issue. She didn't suggest that it didn't work well. In fact, she said it did work well in Washington. I think Article 1, Section 4 means what it says, which is that the Congress may at any time, by regulation, change these rules, and we think we should, because it's pretty obvious that there are millions of people who have been unable to vote because of the way the rules have been set up in some states. We had, I think it was the Brennan Center, do a report on how many actual verifiable cases of voter identity fraud had been found out, and I think the number was 34. I'll find out if that's the actual number, out of 1 billion votes cast. I'm not for 34, but if you disenfranchise 1 million people to catch the 34, you're disenfranchising more people than the errors that were made.
And of course, we're assuming everybody who committed that fraud was caught, which would be a stunning success rate. But I'd be excited if that's the kind of success
There's
rate.
very little evidence of that. I mean, the fraud in North Carolina was a serious one, and not voter fraud. You have to have processes in place We do know that the automatic voter registration, there's a lot of information that is available and provides some additional information for registrars if they use that system. And the case studies in Arizona were very successful on AVR.
I'm thinking, for example, because folks are so transient these days, having a database that Georgia can reference to make sure that if you've left Georgia and you moved to North Carolina and you're now registered in North Carolina, I can scrub you from the Georgia rolls because you've now just registered in North Carolina. Do we have that kind of database checking going on because we're moving to an online system to ensure that kind of integrity?
We do, but the existing system we discovered was wrong 90% of the time. And so we are actually coming up with a better system to cross-reference. The current program is incredibly broken.
And I guess I appreciate the effort folks make to get it right. It seems like, as I read the bill, we're now going to, for the first time, register voters who are ineligible to vote by registering 16-year-olds?
No, no.
I'm reading
it's
that?
pre-registration, and you're not registered to vote. You sign up so that when you turn 18, you become registered. And that's optional on the part of the 16 or 17-year-old, but it's automatic. You're not registered to vote, you're pre-registered to vote. We do it in California, and actually it's been a great system where young people are excited about it. They know they can't vote. But you can go in, and so on your birthday, your 18th birthday, you're automatically registered to vote.
And there's then a check. I'm thinking 18, everybody's gone off to college, you've changed your location. Is there a methodology? It seems like it's just an opportunity riddled with failure points. So
Not that we've found, but it's illegal to vote more than once.
Sure it is.
And that nothing in this changes that.
Mr. Davis, like I say, I had great confidence in my system in Georgia, even though I was on the list to lose in that way. It didn't. The vote was going to be a fair count. No offense to Illinois. I don't trust every other jurisdiction in this country the way I trust my neighbors to make sure that voter integrity counts. I know your jurisdiction is a reliable jurisdiction, but tell me about the one-size-fits-all federal solution here, because we elect our Secretary of State. It's a constitutional office for a reason, as it is in many jurisdictions, and trumping the opportunity for us to protect our own elections with this one-size-fits-all standard is troubling to me.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you have faith in Illinois' system, Mr. Woodall. I do too. Sometimes within Illinois' system, it's been noted that there has been some election issues in certain parts of our state. But I too agree, as somebody who's been in a competitive race, I trust our local county clerks to be the arbiters of our elections. They know who should be registered, they know who should vote, and they know who shouldn't. In one precinct alone, in the 2016 election in my district, there were 70 instances of individuals who were documented to have tried to vote twice. That's a pretty high percentage for one precinct. We've seen with ballot harvesting in North Carolina, an illegal practice there. Somebody may likely go to jail for doing exactly what could be deemed legal in other states, including California. I believe we have to take these fraudulent issues very, very seriously, and what this bill doesn't do is take them seriously. As a matter of fact, there are more penalties for an election registrar or Secretary of State for not following the Husted decision of the Supreme Court and removing voters from the rolls that they know are not eligible to vote within that jurisdiction than there are penalties for somebody who commits election fraud. A national approach, the chairperson and I just have a philosophical disagreement over Article 1 of the Constitution. I believe that the state and local officials are the ones who know and run elections a lot better than bureaucrats in concrete buildings. Taking into consideration the cybersecurity concerns I have of a national voter registration database that could much more easily be hacked into than individual states. Now, Illinois was our voter rolls that are the State Board of Election compiles a major voter file from every county clerk in the 102 counties that make up Illinois and other local jurisdictions that have their own election commissions. They take information and compile it all into one list. In 2016, the summer of 2016, there was a hack attempt. But the information that could have been received there, if that system would have been shut down, Mr. Woodall, all of our county clerks still would have had the most up-to-date information because they're the ones providing from the bottom up the most accurate data to the Illinois State Board of Elections. That's what I have a problem with in this bill. It's taking a top-down approach from here versus the bottom-up approach that's clearly working.
And so for those voter integrity provisions that we already have in our local communities, does this erase those, or can I still pass a higher standard back home than what this bill proposes?
When you look at states like Illinois, we have automatic voter registration. We have early voting permitted from the 40th day preceding an election. We have grace period registration, provisional balloting. Almost every state has absentee balloting. Voting by mail is available in my state, but they're set up to address the certain issues of our state. My biggest fear is this now 622-page bill that's being rushed through Congress that has not been marked up by even committees of jurisdiction. There are too many unanswered questions here. I'm afraid that this top-down approach will usurp many of the protections and provisions that are in place in states like Illinois and in Georgia.
And it seems like the replacement for any sort of voter identification requirements is now a sworn statement that says, yes, I am who I say I am, and yes, I am eligible to vote. Am I reading that? Am I reading that properly?
Yes. States that have chosen to use voter ID would now be overruled by the federal government in signature verification. And as I mentioned in the markup, my signature that is used in the state of Illinois, we use signature verification in Illinois. My signature in Illinois, when I was 18, and I see it every time I go vote, is a lot different than my signature that goes onto my franked envelopes that I know you're so fond of.
Well, to Ms. Lofgren's point, it's already against the law to vote illegally, so swearing that you're not doing something illegal is not...
Oh, pardon me, officer, there's no gambling going on
Well,
here.
I think that's right. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence. Just have one more issue, and it's probably the most important. That relates to the composition of the FEC. We've always had a nonpartisan Federal Election Commission, and I think that many of our successes working together have stemmed from that. My reading of this bill seems as if we're going to change the nonpartisan makeup. Mr. Davis, am I right that the bill no longer ensures that the chair and the vice chair are from different parties?
Yes, and a vote for this bill, Mr. Woodall, would vote to allow the Trump administration to basically control the FEC. And I don't think that was the intention of any of the folks who have co-sponsored this legislation. One party over another should not be a part of our FEC. Our FEC was set up in a bipartisan process to have agreement, just like the Franking Commission that I once chaired. To be able to bulk mail out of the House of Representatives, we have to have bipartisan support. You have to have bipartisan agreement. It's not a committee that has one more than the other. The same with the House Ethics Committee. I don't understand why we're in such a rush to make the FEC a partisan, weaponized institution.
Ms. Lofgren, that seems like one of the more dramatic things of something that is working today to go and change that. Whatever our problems are at the FEC, making it more partisan isn't going to solve.
I don't believe it will be. I don't think it's possible for it to be more partisan than it currently is. It's completely dysfunctional. They're deadlocked on virtually every item. The backlog on items has grown because they can't make a decision because they're deadlocked on everything. The bill provides that you couldn't have a partisan take over the FAC. It mandates that no more than 2 of the 5 commissioners can be from the same political party. It sets up a blue ribbon panel to help name nominees to the commission to make the nomination process more fair and transparent. It also elevates the nonpartisan career staff to make initial findings that can be overruled by the commission itself, but to get them off of ground zero, which is where they are now. Most of the commissions that exist in the federal government are not even-numbered because they deadlock. And that's what we've seen here. It is completely dysfunctional.
Well, the only reason the Franklin Commission succeeds is because I know that my free speech as a member of Congress is limited only in the same way that your free speech as a member of Congress is limited, to the extent that I'm using taxpayer dollars. I just can't tell you how concerned I am that we're going to have a partisan group deciding what one can say and what one can't say at a First Amendment level. There's a reason the ACLU opposes so many of these requirements, and I find myself siding with them. Mr. Chairman, I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And let me just, the chair makes a request for members of both sides. I mean, this panel's been going now since 5 o'clock, and people should be able to ask questions, but I think we can be a little bit more succinct than taking a half an hour each to answer questions. There are a lot of members who are waiting patiently to offer amendments, and you know, I think people have pretty much decided where they are on this bill, and you know, I don't think we need to take a half an hour apiece to be able to make that point on either side, whether we're for it or against it. So I think for the sake of the panel here, who's been here since 5 o'clock, if we could keep our comments, you know, more, there's no limits in this committee, so people can go on for as long as they want. So that's.
People are praying for the 5-minute rule in the committee.
Yeah, we don't have a 5-minute rule here, but I know there are a lot of people waiting, and I know we have votes coming up, so I'll yield to Mr. Perlmutter.
They've called votes.
I'd just say to the chairman, it's interesting you give that speech right before I get to ask questions.
Because I know you.
Was that a hint? Was that a hint to me, sir? All right, let me, I have a whole bunch of questions, but, you know, Mr. Davis, you and I we've served on a bunch of committees together, and we've served on financial services for a long time. So I guess I have some questions for you. Do you know when this bill was filed?
January 3rd.
January 3rd. So we've had the bill, the guts of all of this, for at least 60 days, have we not?
Yes,
And you had an opportunity to read the bill
absolutely.
when it first came out on January 3rd, and I assume that your other members of the House administration had that same opportunity, whether they took advantage of it or not.
Well,
Yes or no?
oh, absolutely. But there's a big difference
All right,
between
so-
reading it.
So the reason I ask that is you then had a markup in House administration, did you not?
Mm-hmm.
How many days after the bill was introduced? When was your markup?
Last week.
Last week. So 45, 50 days to kind of consider the bill? Yes? So the reason I ask that is that consistently in this committee from the Republicans, we've heard there's not enough time to consider anything. The appropriations bills that actually were written by the Republican Party last session. We haven't had time to read all of that, even though they'd been in place for months, okay? We had a tiny little veterans bill on daycare, whether daycare should be provided or not if somebody went in for a doctor's appointment. And there wasn't enough time to have read that bill. We had some stuff on Yemen. There wasn't enough time to have read that bill. I'm beginning to think that in the minority, you guys are very busy because you don't have enough time to read anything.
Well, with all due respect, we learned a lot from you in the minority.
Well, so you know, in the last hour and a half, with the exception of the last few questions by Mr. Woodall, we've talked about how this is such a rush that there hasn't been enough time. You haven't been able to consider things. This is not fair. That's been the main subject. And the second subject is on public finance and the fear that the public finance is going to get out of control. And I can appreciate that position. But I want to ask about some of the other parts of the bill.
Sure.
So you're supportive, and I assume, were the other members of your committee supportive of the sections on congressional redistricting?
I'm not aware. I can tell you I made it perfectly clear I was.
Okay. What about the section that requires the president and the vice president to submit their taxes?
Well, I think that provision is one that needed to be marked up. That's a provision that should have gone through other committees of jurisdiction. There's some clear constitutional issues. And you know, it's interesting that we are good friends. I respect your opinion. I have not served on financial services, but I appreciate you thinking I've been there. That's good. That's
Maybe
good.
we're around each other too much.
We are around each other, and, you know, we have worked on issues together, and I consider you a friend. But the sheer fact that this bill is coming up almost a month and a half after it was introduced on day one, I still have a problem with the concern.
Are you telling me that neither you nor the other Republican members of your caucus didn't know that taxes, the president's taxes and the submission of his taxes has been an issue for at least 2 years?
Well, that's I don't see how that's a relevant point,
It's
Mr.
the issue
Perlmutter.
saying, well, all of these things are new, we need more time, we haven't had enough time. So taxes, okay, let's go to something else. What about the part on taxpayer settlement of harassment suits? I mean, that's nothing new.
No, that's one we've agreed with. As a matter of fact, Chairperson Lofgren and I were part of the committee in the last Congress that actually revamped the Congressional Accountability Act.
What about the making sure that foreign agents, like Russia and its agents, don't play a part in our elections in America?
Well, I think every Republican and every Democrat can agree we don't want foreign agents playing a role, but I would argue that this bill,
section of this bill, is
I
it
would
not?
argue that this bill's national voter registration database would allow nefarious individuals to have easier access to do so.
Okay. But it's not a surprise that we have a section of the bill directed at foreign agents and their influence in American elections. I mean, it's not a surprise, is it?
Oh, there's not many surprises in a bill this big.
All right, well, what about disclosure to shareholders of monies that corporations are putting into elections? Is that something that, you know, you looked at, you considered, your committee had a chance to talk about?
I would have loved to have been able to have a chance to sit down and help write these provisions. We're all for more disclosure. We're all for more making sure that everybody has a right to vote and everybody who's eligible to vote gets a chance to do so. But we weren't consulted. We weren't even offered an opportunity to help draft this bill, which is why we, the 3 members of the House Administration Committee, the only committee that marked it up, after a total of 15 minutes of Q&A for each of us to ask witnesses, we offered 28 amendments. We initially offered 37, but we put them down to 28 amendments in 5 hours, and we offered to make this bill better. And not one time was any amendment accepted by anyone in the majority. We were given an opportunity to try and make it better, and we didn't. Matter of fact, Chairperson Lofgren introduced clerical corrections, and we gladly accepted.
Okay. What about the section in the bill about ending the decision in Citizens United so that individuals make contributions in campaigns and not corporations?
Interesting, because as I sit here, I probably, outside of Mr. Woodall, had the most dark money from dark money Democratic groups spent against me in the last campaign.
So then I take it you support it.
Well, I'm for many increases in disclosure requirements. However, this bill is not the answer, Mr. Perlmutter. This bill is saddled with now a new program where taxpayer dollars will go toward funding our congressional campaigns. There is no reason why.
Well, I understand. So we spent an hour and a half talking about public financing of campaigns.
It needs a lot more than an hour and a half.
Dark money
It
and
needs
corporate
more
money out of campaigns.
That's
I mean, we
adding
spent an hour
to
and a
it.
half, and I get it. You don't like that section.
It's adding
neither
to
did
it.
Mr. Cole.
It's adding to it.
But
It's
you
not
don't
getting
like
out.
the dark money in the election, so this was an approach to end Citizens United.
Of course,
I mean,
we don't like that.
again, that case was decided 9 years ago. So despite protestations that haven't had enough time to consider these things, you know, it's been a rush to judgment, we really haven't had a say in this. You had 9 years to talk about the effects of Citizens United, or 8 years, while the Republican Party had the majority in Congress, and Citizens United has continued to plague, in my opinion, elections since then because of dark money coming into campaigns. So I guess my point is just every time, and I can see a consistent theme, and obviously it's going to be a message for the Republican Party, but we just haven't had enough time to deal with these things. And I'm saying to you, that's one that's been on the back burner for at least 8 years, and it didn't deal with it. So I get it, and I'm going to yield back.
Well, I appreciate your comments. I appreciate your friendship, Mr. Perlmutter. And I would end by saying, I said the same thing during our tax relief bill. We had 26 years. Last time we reformed our broken tax code was when I had a mullet and a mustache.
Well, just on that,
and I heard the same arguments that you didn't have enough time.
That bill is the epitome of not having regular order. So no hearings, nothing. And all of a sudden, we've got $1.5 trillion hole in our federal budget, not one hearing, not one markup. So I appreciate it, and I am going to yield my time back.
All right, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the statement from Representative Dean Phillips on amendments number 73, 75, 77, 79 to H.R. 1. He was here for quite a while. And a statement of Congresswoman Kathy Castor. I think we are out of time in terms of the vote, and so we are going to adjourn. Unfortunately, I have to request that. I'm sorry, we're going to recess. We're going to recess. I'm going to have to request that you come back. In the meantime, I would ask members on both sides of the aisle who have questions to try to think of them in advance and narrow them down so that we can get this panel out of here as quickly as possible after votes and get to the other people who have amendments. Yeah, these guys have questions for you, so you have to come back. Yeah. Right? Yeah, so yes, you have to come back. Mr. Burgess insists on it. So, I know, so we stand in recess.
Let me speak with Don, but if he needs to see if the rest of our members here. This last quote. Ask for 50 votes over there. They're not being so we need a critical mass.
So this House Rules Committee meeting is taking a recess now. Members have to cast a couple of votes on the floor of the House of Representatives as they continue here in the Rules Committee working on the guidelines for debate on H.R. 1. That's the Democrats' campaign finance, voting rights, and ethics legislation. The official title of the bill is the For the People Act of 2019. What we're going to do after the recess is resume our live coverage of this House Rules Committee on C-SPAN 2. Assuming the Senate will be finished up by then, we'll pick up the coverage of this Rules Committee meeting on C-SPAN 2 a bit later on this evening. Congressman Jim McGovern is your chairman of the Rules Committee, and we are told the bill is expected to move to the House floor for debate there tomorrow. Debate will continue, and then we expect a final vote on Friday morning.
Thank you. The only thing we have to fear is fear
so. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
C-SPAN's newest book, The Presidents, noted historians rank America's best and worst chief executives, provides insight into the lives of the 44 American presidents through stories gathered by interviews with noted presidential historians. Explore the life events that shaped our leaders, challenges they faced, and the legacies they have left behind. Published by Public Affairs, C-SPAN's The Presidents will be on shelves April 23rd. But you can pre-order your copy as a hardcover or ebook today at cspan.org/thepresidents or wherever books are sold.
In the morning here on C-SPAN 3, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen heads to Capitol Hill to testify on border security and other issues. That's live at 10 a.m. Eastern. Later in the day, a hearing on sexual assault in the military focused on response and prevention. The Senate Armed Services Committee meets live at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Also on C-SPAN 3, cspan.org, and the free C-SPAN radio app.
A conversation about the concept known as Medicare for All with two guests joining us. Here in studio is Joe Antos of the American Enterprise Institute, who serves as a healthcare and retirement policy scholar. Also joining us from Boston, Dr. Adam Gaffney of the group Physicians for a National Health Program. He serves as their president. And to both of you gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Gaffney, let's start with you. When we hear this concept of Medicare for All, what appears in your mind, and what do you think has been introduced here in Congress, or at least some of the ideas connected to this concept introduced in Congress?
Sure. Well, the concept of Medicare for All is not an especially complicated one. In the name itself, it's Medicare, so a universal program that's currently for seniors that we would apply for all, meaning everyone in the nation. But a key additional point I would make is that we think of this as improved Medicare for all. So this is a program that would expand Medicare to everyone in the country, but that would make it a much better program by for instance, making the benefits comprehensive, including things like dental care that Medicare does not currently cover, as well as improving Medicare by eliminating cost barriers to care, things like copays and deductibles. So that's the basic concept of Medicare for All. And there is now, as you mentioned, a bill in both the House and the Senate that are Medicare for All bills that would create such a system for the United States. This is sometimes referred to as single payer as well. And it's essentially a universal health care system that would provide comprehensive benefits without financial barriers of care to the American public.
Mr. Antos, same question to you.
Well, I think this is an aspiration as opposed to a reality. I think that's the biggest problem. It sounds great for everybody to have complete coverage for absolutely everything at no direct out-of-pocket cost to themselves. That costs money. That costs a lot of money. The bill that was introduced last week isn't fleshed out enough to have a guess at a number, but Bernie Sanders' bill, which is somewhat similar, comes in around $30 trillion over 10 years. That's a lot of money. That means that we're going to have to tax the same people who are getting something that they believe is free. We're going to have to tax them very, very heavily. In the real world, nothing is free. I think the real question is, what can we do to improve health insurance for people and improve coverage without breaking the bank?
Dr. Gaffney, then, to this idea of cost, especially as you see it as an expanded type of proposal, how do you pay for these kind of services?
So we are already paying for this Medicare for All. We are already paying for it through premiums, taxes, copays, and deductibles. I think the $30-something trillion figure that Joe pointed to is from a think tank, libertarian think tank study, which actually found that overall, although it would cost money, we would need new taxes, overall healthcare spending as a nation would fall by $2 trillion over 10 years. So we are already spending this money. We are already spending it through premiums, copays, and deductibles. So we're not talking about increasing the amount of money we spend as a nation on health care. We're talking about financing it in a smarter way so that people pay into the system according to their means, and then they get the health care they need in terms of their means, or needs rather. So long story short, we're already spending this money. And don't forget, approximately two-thirds of American healthcare spending is already financed by taxes. So we're talking about having to tax finance the remaining portion, which is a much smaller number than many people think. We can't afford the status quo is the reality.
Mr. Antos, if those existing streams do take place, as our guest has said, what's wrong with then the idea of expanding these type of services if the money's already there, so to speak?
Well, the money isn't already there. Let's take Representative Jayapal's bill. She adds something that even Bernie Sanders wouldn't do, which is that she would cover all long-term care services at no cost to anyone. There was a provision in not quite similar to that, but there was a provision like that in the Affordable Care Act. It was abandoned by the Obama administration. It was clear that, except for a little budget trickery, this was going to cost a lot of money, and that was a proposal that required people to pay for it. Here's a proposal where you don't pay for it, and so you're not only going to have expenditures that are already being made by people and by the Medicaid program, but you're going to also substitute a federal program with federal tax dollars for the kinds of services that don't get paid for now. Now, that might be a great thing if you could do it, but an awful lot of long-term care is provided by the family. It's not monetized. When you monetize that, you've got a huge fiscal problem.
Our guests are going to be with us until 9 o'clock. If you want to ask them questions about this Medicare for All concept, if you support this idea, it's 202-748-8000. If you oppose it, 202-748-8001. You can make comments on Twitter at C-SPAN WJ. Dr. Gaffney, when it comes to the legislative proposal from Representative Jayapal, I think the idea is to automatically shift people into this Medicare for All period for 2 years. What would that do to the existing system that we have in the United States?
Well, the existing system produces enormous waste, and we need to do better. The administrative overhead of private health insurance plans are always cited as a greater than 10%. The administrative overhead of Medicare, traditional Medicare, is closer to 2%. The waste that our current system imposes is enormous, and we can do much better. Let's also not forget that there's 29 million people who remain uninsured in this country. There's 44 million people who are underinsured, meaning they have insurance, but their copays or deductibles are so large they can't afford to get the care they need. That is not a sustainable system. The other funny thing about this discussion when it comes to costs is that it's often stated that we could not afford a single-payer system. Yet the United States has a uniquely expensive healthcare system, and we don't have a single-payer system. The systems that do have single-payer systems spend much less than us. So there's a real paradox here that's frankly confusing. Now, it is true that healthcare is very expensive, but the fact is we all need it. The reality is that there is no long-term care coverage in this country, essentially, except for Medicaid, which requires you to essentially become impoverished before you can have access to it. That is not a good system. So yes, healthcare is expensive, but it is already expensive under the status quo. And financing it publicly will, in fact, make it less expensive, will, in fact, increase the efficiency, not the reverse.
Mr. Antos.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that folks who support Medicare for All like to talk about administrative expenses. Administrative expenses are probably 10% of total national health spending. Where the real inefficiency is in the delivery of health care. It's the way we use healthcare services. We have expectations that are far exceed what I think citizens in Britain and in other countries have about what kind of health care should they get, how quickly should they get it, can they go to any doctor, any hospital in the country? That's the general view in this country. We're not good at standing in line. And that's an issue. That's an issue. So the fact is that our healthcare system. I agree with Dr. Gaffney. We're in a healthcare system that's going 90 miles an hour down the road, and there's a brick wall in front of us. And the problem is that transition from 90 miles an hour to stopped at the brick wall is pretty painful. And it's going to take a lot more than 2 years and a lot more effort and a lot more thought than I think has been presented in any of these bills.
Let me give you a specific to both. Then, Mr. Antos, you start first. What happens then to private insurance if this system that Representative Jayapal is actually becomes a reality?
Well, under Representative Jayapal's program, private insurance would essentially disappear. She does have a provision in there that says, well, if you want to contract privately with a physician or anybody else for that matter for services that are not covered by the national plan, go ahead. But of course, virtually all services will be covered by the national plan. So that's pretty much the end of that system. I think the key here is, again, it's that transition. It's saying to people, you can't keep the health plan you now have, even if you like it. You're going to move into this other thing. Maybe it's better, but maybe it won't be better. It will certainly be more expensive.
Dr. Gaffney, because you're a physician and you have other physicians that you represent, what about this idea of private insurance going by the wayside?
So everyone I know cares about the doctors and hospitals they can go to. They care about the drugs they can obtain that they need. Very few people care about whether their healthcare company is Cigna or Aetna or United Health. There's very little brand loyalty to private insurance companies in this country. What people care about is access to doctors, hospitals, and medicines. That's what they care about. So this idea that there's going to be this painful switch when people have to say goodbye to Cigna or Aetna, no one cares.